I'm going to talk not about radiation, but just about particulate matter, and specifically about particulate matter that's under 2.5 microns in diameter. And these are the finest, these are very fine particles. And the reason we're concerned about those is those are the particles that when you breathe, they go deeply into your lungs because they are so small. We have a network of PM 2.5 monitors in New Mexico. We've got monitors, 2 of them in Santa Fe, one at the Santa Fe Airport and one at the Runnels Building, which is on the corner of Alta Vista and St. Francis Drive. There's also, Lano has 2 PM 2.5 monitors, one at Los Alamos and one at White Rock. In addition to those monitors, we work with the Forest Service. They've got a bunch of portable monitors, PM 2.5 monitors that they can set out. So we work with them on developing locations to set those out. They put them in Cochiti, Espanola, and Abiquiu for this fire. I don't know if you guys ever remember, but we also had a lot of impacts in June from the Wallow fire. So we also had a lot of monitors set in other places, like in Camado and Reserve, but I don't think you guys are probably as interested in those. Although we did get a lot of impacts from those fires in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Taos. From the Las Conchas fire, the areas that were most heavily impacted and had the highest readings were Los Alamos, White Rock, Cochiti, Espanola, and Abiquiu. Taos also got some hits, but not as bad as those areas. Surprisingly, Santa Fe really didn't have a lot of bad air quality days during the Las Conchas fire. The data for most of these monitors was available online, real time, and some were the monitors that we have online all the time, and the ones the lab runs, you can go back and look at historic data. So if you're interested in looking at the PM2.5 data at Los Alamos, White Rock, or in Santa Fe, or Taos, you can go online and download that data directly. It's still there. It's always online. So one of the questions that I was asked was, in our professional opinion, what non-radiological public health risk resulted from the Las Conchas fire? Particulate matter causes problems both pulmonary, so in your lungs, in your bronchial tubes, things like that, and cardiovascular. But there's difference in different kinds of exposure, acute meaning short-term exposure or chronic exposure. So you're going to find that people have more significant impacts in areas that are always polluted. We're quite lucky in northern New Mexico when you're talking about particulate matter pollution. We generally have very good air quality. So even though some days seemed really bad, it seemed really smoky, the actual values weren't that high. It's just that we're used to very low values, and when the values get a little bit high, it seems worse than it is. We also did have some very, very bad days. So the health effects for acute exposure, you might have a really smoky day, but then you actually don't get sick for 3 or 4 days afterwards. You start feeling the effects of that. And that's been documented. These have been documented by studies. However, acute exposure tends to have short-term impacts that people recover from. And there's a lot of studies that have been done on that. Sensitive groups obviously are at the most risk. So people who have existing compromised systems, people with asthma, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, or cardiovascular disease, or any kind of heart disease, they're going to be the ones who are going to be affected at much lower levels than other people. So those are the non-radiological public health risks that we were concerned about. There's some discussion too about whether or not ozone increases as a result of smoke from fires, and Mike mentioned, there are a lot of different types of pollutants that come off of a forest fire. Actually, nitrogen oxides can come off of a forest fire, and that can cause ozone, but we didn't see really heightened ozone during this time. The other question that I was given in advance to ask was about how we make air quality advisories. What information do we use, who makes them, and how are they made available to the public? And hopefully you're all aware that we did put out a couple of advisories during these fires, the Walla fire, the Las Conchas fire, and the Pacheco Canyon fire. We had, once the Walla fire started and we started getting impacts in New Mexico from that, we set up a group and we started having conference calls daily. Every morning, weekends, we were all working every day on this. Department of Health, the National Weather Service, the Air Quality Bureau, the Forest Service, Arizona Department, their air quality people were also on these calls, as well as EPA. So, and then towards the end, we started having some LAMA people on the call as well. The calls kind of got bigger as they went on. What we did on those calls was we looked at the predicted weather patterns. We looked at the monitoring data from the day prior to see, how bad was it in what areas. And we tried to figure out what are the areas that are most likely to be impacted and how badly do we think they're going to be impacted based on predicted weather and based on the potential for the fire growth. And then we would put out information about that. Every day we came up with a forecast and a monitoring summary for the previous day's data. Now that was, we released that data, that was on INSEWeb every day, and we also released it through the Environment Department and the Health Department's media list. So that went out to the media list, including newspapers, radios, blogs, and things like that, those kinds of outlets, as well as the Weather Service. The Weather Service, I think, did a great job. They're really, really good at getting news out to the media because the media is used to picking it up from the Weather Service, when they get the weather forecasts. So I think that was probably our most successful outlet for the data, was getting it out through the Weather Service. So, and I didn't see any questions up here that came out today about air quality from particulate. So that's,
I did bring a show and tell.
You did?
I brought my boss, Steve. Could you stand up and tell him about your acute situation with your lungs?
The crew of us collecting the air samplers daily during the fire. I do have asthma, and I'm one of the susceptible people. And it was slow to come on, but I noticed I was hacking after the fire. I was up at Los Alamos that had the bad air quality. When I did
talking, buddy, Steve.
I'm better than I wanted when I was. When I did go to my physician, he did say I probably was instigated by something that probably had gone during a fire. And I was up there during some of the very bad days. We're very proximal to the fire. Actually, our office is right, almost in the foothills. So my advice is, if you're like me, don't do that.
I think that's very good advice.
Yeah, and it's a common sense thing. So.
And there were some very high values. The highest values were at Los Alamos, White Rock. Those were really the highest values. Espanola had some elevated values as well that would be considered to be in the 1 hour act. 1 hour would be considered to be hazardous, but the actual standards based on 24 hours. And the 24-hour values weren't as bad as the 1 hour values, obviously, when you start averaging data, it's lower. But there were some extremely high 1 hour averages, high even in Espanola and Abiquiu and Cochiti, but not as bad as in Los Alamos and White Rock.